Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started now. How big, how intrusive, how broad does our government need to be to most effectively fight the war on terrorism? It's especially appropriate to consider that question today in 2011 for a whole host of reasons. First of all, today happens to be Veterans Day, so military topics quite appropriate. And thank you to all who are in the audience who have served. It's also been a full decade since the 9/11 terrorist attacks first put this set of issues on our collective agenda. The legal changes and the policy changes since 2001, it's appropriate now, 10 years on, to reflect on whether those initiatives are well advised. Also, the rise of the Tea Party movement in recent years has helped inspire a renewed appreciation for the limits on the power of government. So what then can be said about these post-9/11 security policies and practices? Consider, for instance, the surveillance tools that the government has adopted in the past decade, such as the Patriot Act, such as the NSA's terrorist surveillance program, airport screening policies. Are these necessary tools to keep Americans safe from Al-Qaeda? Do they strike the right balance between the imperatives of security on the one hand and the need for respect for privacy and civil liberties on the other? Consider also recent assertions of executive power, the Libya operation, for instance, or the increase in drone attacks and targeted killings. Are these policies desirable, and is it inevitable that the executive branch will take the laboring oar in charting national security policies on these questions? Or should Congress assert itself and play a more active role in managing these sorts of operations? Finally, consider the post-9/11 reorganizations that our government has experienced. The creation of a new Director of National Intelligence, the creation of a new Department of Homeland Security. Does reshuffling the bureaucratic deck of cards make us safer? Does it cure the problems that those reorganizations were intended to remedy? Or does it create entirely new pathologies? Today we're joined by a distinguished panel to help answer these and a number of other questions. Here's how we'll proceed. Each panelist will take 8 minutes to talk on his or her own. We'll then have a back and forth among members of the panel, and after that we will open it up to questions from the audience. First, we'll be hearing from Stewart Baker, who's a partner at the firm of Steptoe and Johnson. He's the author of a book entitled Skating on Stilts: Why We Aren't Stopping Tomorrow's Terrorism. Before his return to Steptoe, Stewart was Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, the top policy official at the department, and oversaw the U.S. negotiations with our European allies on collection of important sensitive personal data. And the use of that data to help prevent terrorist attacks. Before his most recent turn in government, Stewart served as General Counsel of the National Security Agency. Next, we'll hear from Julian Sánchez, who is a research fellow at the Cato Institute. His work focuses on intelligence, electronic surveillance, and the privacy and civil liberties implications of those activities. His work has appeared in a wide range of publications, from The Nation to National Review. His most recent Cato study is entitled Leashing the Surveillance State: How to Reform Patriot Act Surveillance Authorities. Third, we will hear from Veronique de Rugy, who's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She previously was a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and worked at Cato as well. Her primary research interests include the federal budget, homeland security, taxation, and financial privacy issues. She writes for Reason Magazine, The American, which is AEI's publication, and The Corner at National Review Online. Finally, Ben Wittes from the Brookings Institution, where he is a senior fellow in governance studies. Ben also is the co-director of the Harvard Law School and Brookings Project on Law and Security. Ben is the author of a number of books relating to national security policy, including Detention and Denial, The Case for Candor After Guantanamo, Law and the Long War, and also Legislating the War on Terror. Ben also is a co-founder and frequent contributor to the Lawfare blog. Previously served as an editorial writer at the Washington Post, and his work has appeared in a list of publications that are too numerous to mention here. So with that, we'll turn it over to Stewart to get this conversation started. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm going to be about as obnoxious as I can be on this topic, and that's pretty obnoxious. taking the view that our privacy and civil liberties doctrines have great costs that we don't always appreciate, and that we are at risk of overdoing it even now, even though that may seem to be counterintuitive to all of you. Rather than begin with some of that, I thought I'd tell you the story of how it was that I came to this rather obnoxious stance. And it begins with the wall between law enforcement and intelligence, which many of you will remember from the 9/11 Commission hearings, was the wall that gave the right a stick to beat Jamie Gorelick with for the rest of her career. In fact, that whole flap over the wall and whose fault it was and her role in it ended up making the wall the one thing that the 9/11 Commission couldn't talk candidly about and didn't. And in fact, the story of the wall is both more interesting and more appalling than most of us who only followed the press would actually believe. But I've been involved with that since the 1990s when I was at NSA, and I followed it closely, and in the end, that's what has driven me to the far right of this panel. And in this company, that's saying something. The wall is a civil liberties doctrine which is designed to say, you know, we understand that sometimes you'll do both criminal and national security investigations of the same person because terrorism is a crime, and so you have both criminal and intelligence reasons to follow certain people. But we don't want our courts and we don't want American citizens to be subject to the kinds of aggressive, intrusive techniques that our intelligence agencies can and really must, to do their job, deploy. And so we will say that you should not use these intelligence wiretap capabilities to further your criminal investigation. You should use traditional criminal investigative methods to do that. And we will put a wall between the criminal and the intelligence parts of the government when they are looking at the same people. A very sensible, really a consensus view in the 1990s, and civil liberties protective. During the 1990s, the Justice Department and the Southern District of New York really advanced the view that law enforcement could solve the terrorism problem, or at least be the principal way of addressing it by indicting. They indicted Osama bin Laden famously, and a number of other terrorists. And as they got farther and farther into the effort to use Justice Department prosecutorial tools against terrorists, they began to hanker for the kinds of intelligence that our intelligence agencies were gathering, and they began to see the wall as an impediment to knowing everything they needed to know, and they thought, well, we can work this. We don't have to have a strict rule. In the Justice Department, the one thing you do not want to do is fight for your life with the prosecutors, because the prosecutors at the Justice Department, they are to the Justice Department what fighter pilots are to the Air Force. They are the jocks who make the place run. And in the end, you're going to lose your fight with them. The office that was in charge of maintaining this wall saw the handwriting on the wall and went to the FISA court. They dealt with the FISA court and sort of said, you know, this wall, you know, we believe in it, you believe in it, we're going to lose this fight. And the FISA court said, no, we'll take it over. We'll write this wall into every single FISA order, and then it won't be up to the prosecutors or the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General whether to enforce it. We'll enforce it. We'll make sure it sticks. They took that over. The Justice Department did not appeal, and they began to enforce the wall. Again, civil liberties uppermost in their mind. March of 2001, one of the things they did was they said, you must give us, everybody who's engaged in this process must give us an affidavit, explain to us how they're enforcing the wall, how they're abiding by the wall, all the things that they're doing to be true to our orders. And they got all these affidavits and assurances from the participants in the process, and inevitably, this is a big bureaucracy, there were screw-ups. And the FISA office goes to the FISA court and says there have been some screw-ups. Finally, the FISA court got tired of the screw-ups, and they took the head of a pretty prominent anti-terrorism office in the FBI, and they said, "You've submitted an affidavit to us which is false. That's unacceptable. You will never appear, and none of your affidavits will ever be accepted again by the court. We're asking for an investigation." This is an investigation that could have ended in a perjury charge. It was a extraordinarily serious thing. It was the end of the career, believed to be the end of the career of a very well-regarded FBI agent. This is March of 2001. For the next several months, there was nothing more important to any FBI agent in this business, if he valued his career, than making sure that the FISA court did not decide to take him next and make an example of him next. All of this is exactly what you'd expect if you're enforcing civil liberties doctrine, and no one would have thought it was at all unusual that that was what was happening, if not for what happened in August of that year. In August of that year, the FBI found out that there were 2 al-Qaeda terrorists who had entered the United States. These were stone-cold killers. They were up to no good. The FBI knew it. Everybody at that point knew they were here. We had 2 weeks to catch them. The Cole bombing task force was up, running, well-funded. It was running out of the criminal side of the Southern District of New York because they had all the resources, they had the juice to actually put together an enormous task force. They said, when they found out about this, which they probably shouldn't have under the wall, but they found out about it, they said, "Let us go find these guys. You know, the intel side of the FBI, it's puny, it doesn't have any resources. They're not going to be able to catch these guys the way we could. We can send agents out everywhere to find them." And they were told, "I'm sorry, there is nothing more important to the FBI than making sure that this wall is enforced, because otherwise we'll all be in front of the FISA court. And the FISA court will wreck all of our careers. You will not do a thing. Sit down, shut up." And that's what they did. The intel side of the FBI, in a very underfunded way, started looking for these guys and found them, on the morning of 9/11. That story has never really been told because it came out in bits and pieces over the next 4 or 5 years. The missed opportunity there, the 2 weeks when we could have had dozens of agents combing the country to find these guys, when they had made reservations in their own damn names on these planes, is a lost opportunity that we will always regret. And the last thought I have is living with this story is what has made me deeply skeptical of casual invocations of civil liberty doctrine. Imagine that you're the president or the vice president of the United States, and the National Security Agency, and you know this story, National Security Agency comes to you afterwards and says, "We have an idea for how to do additional wiretaps that would catch terrorists, but you might, it's a close call, you might have to go to the FISA court for permission." If you knew that story, would you go? That's my guess about how we ended up with the warrantless wiretap program that we have. The FISA court had disgraced itself in the eyes of a very small but very influential audience. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Stewart. Next, Julian, please.
Sure. I'm going to risk giving Stewart a heart attack by saying I will halfway agree with one aspect of his remarks, which is that I do think we need to focus on the importance of information sharing between intelligence agencies more and less on increasing the amount of information the intelligence agencies are able to collect. If you look at the causes of intelligence failure both before 9/11 and more recently, in the case of, for example, the notorious underwear bomber, it's, in case after case, what you see is that failures are usually not attributable to a failure to collect sufficient amounts of intelligence. Often it's the information that was already in the possession of the intelligence community was not effectively shared. Some of that may have to do with bureaucratic limitations on... with bureaucratic limitations on information sharing, but most of the serious scholarly attempts to look at the causes of intelligence dysfunction find that it's the agencies themselves that, for reasons of internal agency culture, of jealously guarding their own secrets, of being essentially hesitant to work with other agencies, to even give badges to members of other agencies to facilitate coordination, that are I think the most serious barrier. And it's easy then to say, well, it was the bad old FISA court, or that awful wall that were preventing us from doing this. But this is, I don't think, wholly or even really largely something that can be laid at the door of those restrictions. But let's agree that it's a good thing that there's more intelligence sharing now happening. I want to turn to the way we've focused, though, on increasing information gathering, which doesn't really seem to have been the problem in most of these cases. It's become such a cliche to talk about the trade-off between privacy and security, or liberty and security, that it sometimes feels like that's not just a zero-sum relationship, but almost an automatic inverse relationship. So if you want to be more secure, eliminate privacy, or increase the intrusiveness of surveillance tools, and automatically greater security will follow. A moment's reflection should show that's false, right? Probably the single easiest and best thing we did to prevent the repeat of a 9/11 style attack was reinforcing airplane cockpit doors, which doesn't invade anyone's privacy at all. And the trend that I think we see is that there is more and more use of relatively intrusive and relatively less checked tools, even as it seems as though the threat we face is growing less pronounced and immediate. We didn't know how many more attacks were coming in the days right after 9/11. But if you look, for example, as a RAND analyst did at the homegrown terror plots that have been the focus of so much attention recently, he found 32 plots that resulted in prosecutions since 9/11. But of those, they found that only 10 actually developed anything resembling an operational plan, as opposed to just talking in the abstract. And of those 10, 6 were FBI stings, where it was the FBI itself that actually provided the material and the ability to attempt to actually implement something. You can see this also in the rate of declinations of referrals to federal prosecutors, right? So again, the year right after 9/11, federal prosecutors declined about a third of the cases that were referred to them by the FBI for prosecution related to terrorism. In the last couple of years, that's risen to about 80%. So there's a whole lot of investigation going on. In the first 4 months of 2009, for instance, the FBI actually opened over 11,000 assessments of people and groups. A little over 8,000 were finished, and 427 of those actually turned into further investigations. There's a lot of investigation happening, but what's coming out of it doesn't seem to be hugely useful at the end of the day. We again, I think, are told how vital intrusive tools are, but when, with the benefit of hindsight, we try to examine that utility, often those claims don't pan out. You think, for example, about national security letters, right? So again, even as the threat seems to be diminishing, in 2010, we broke, as far as I know, the record for the number of Americans who were subject to national security, the most intrusive sort of national security letters that get actual telecommunications and banking records. So it was more than 14,000 Americans whose telecommunications or banking information was seized without judicial approval that year. And the trend over time has been that while national security letters were in the initial years primarily used to acquire information about foreign nationals, now the majority are used to acquire information about American citizens. While previously, national security letters were used basically exclusively in full investigations, that is, investigations with some sort of serious factual predicate, the Attorney General's guidelines were changed to permit their use in preliminary investigations, which have less basis to believe there's actually some kind of criminal activity happening or terrorist-related activity. And then again, within a couple of years, the majority of national security letters were issued in those sorts of preliminary investigations. So what we see is tens of thousands of Americans' sensitive telecommunication records, which increasingly tend to reveal protected First Amendment protected activity, like associations online, who you're speaking with, where you're speaking, perhaps anonymously, what mailing lists, political or religious, you might be a member of, and that information goes into FBI databases and is stored there basically indefinitely. So we have this growing archive of information about Americans' activities, and yet relatively few actual concrete results from all that massive information gathering. And from, I think, 2003 to 2005, there were something like 53 criminal referrals from produced by about 150,000 national security letters, and they were all for money laundering, fraud, and immigration violations. We know also that the national security letters have been subject to what the Inspector General called widespread and serious misuse, where the availability without, again, judicial approval of this tool encouraged investigators in one division to begin bypassing them entirely and simply making verbal requests for information from telecommunications providers. So there were records pertaining to more than 3,500 phone numbers, including reporters for the Washington Post and New York Times, that were, again, required strictly by verbal request or by Post-it notes placed on the monitor of a telecommunications company representative. In many cases, these requests were made in investigations that were actually not covered by the National Security Letter statutes, that is, investigations in which it would not have been legitimate to actually obtain a national security letter. So I think we have to worry about this quantity of information collection without a proven payoff. We hear again and again it's a valuable tool, but beyond making people's lives easier if they don't have to go before a judge, I don't think we've seen proof that it's actually necessary, that it actually is resulting in results that otherwise could not have been obtained. The same thing with the warrantless wiretap program. We were told this is vital, this saves lives. But then we later learned that of the thousands of people in the US who were subject to surveillance under this program each year, fewer than 10 were apparently suspicious enough to justify being the targets of a FISA warrant to intercept their domestic communications. When the OIG later looked into that program, they spoke to a lot of intelligence officials who said, well, it was a valuable tool in the toolbox, but when it came time to say, well, can you point to concrete intelligence successes? Can you point to, for example, a terrorist plot that was foiled as a result of this program? They were not actually able to come up with anything. We see the same thing with respect to 215 letters. We don't know that much about how they're used, but Senator Wyden has suggested that there is an interpretation by the FISA court, a secret interpretation that has expanded the breadth of that authority to acquire business records with judicial approval, but subject to a relatively low standard. We think it probably involves location tracking or some kind of bulk records acquisition. And again, when the OIG looked at that, they were hard-pressed to find a case where you could attribute the disruption of a terror plot to information gained via 215 letters. So I think the question to ask is, 10 years in, what is the evidence that more and more information gathering with less and less supervision, and indeed on a scale that's really probably impossible to effectively supervise, is actually not just nice or convenient, but necessary to keeping us safe? And the evidence just isn't there.
Thank you, Julian. Veronique?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll start by saying that I think the risk of terrorism is very small compared to the attention it commands and compared to the spending that it commands. If you think about it, I mean, Homeland 9/11, which was a very tragic day in the history of this country, over 3,000 lives were lost. However, that very same year, 155,000 people died of lung cancer. Every single year, some 44,000 people die in car accidents. And yet, we have put an entire system in place following these deaths. There's, I think, absolutely a role for the federal government in Homeland Security. That being said, I think that there is a way to do it, and that the way Homeland Security spending and these decisions are made are probably unlikely to bring a lot of security, or at least a level of the desired security that we can expect for the money that is spent. And I'd like to argue that this because there's a wide difference between the politics of Homeland Security and the economics of Homeland Security. So what is the politics of Homeland Security? Well, a lot of the decisions made on Homeland Security and what programs to put in place and how spending decisions should be made are the product of knee-jerk reaction. There's a lot of reaction to the news of the day. It means that we spend a lot of time fighting yesterday's battles. There's a lot also overstatement about the type of risk that we face. Also, I think that the way we respond to Homeland Security is very illustrative of the way things are done in Washington, where the one systematic response to pretty much everything is spending. And also the fact that the way Washington measures success is not to actually measure how effective policies put in place are in reducing a given risk, if we decide that this is a risk that needs to be addressed, but more it is measured on how much money we've spent on that given program. The overarching, I think, characteristic of the politics of Homeland Security is the lack of risk management or cost-benefit analysis in the way decisions are made. Now, contrast it with the way economists would think about Homeland Security. Economists think of the world about, they think about trade-offs, return on investment, probability, and in particular, we do this also with security. And I would argue that all of us do it, consciously or not. Like all of us decides, to carry a key with us, to lock our house against the risk of burglary. We know that driving is dangerous, and yet many of us decide to drive our cars today. There may be a big part of that that's the product of denial. That being said, I mean, we still decide that it's worth doing. So trade-offs are a lot of what drive our decisions, and the understanding that resources are scarce and we need to allocate them in the best possible way. When economists actually think about trade-offs, risk management, and priorities, one of the things that we find is that probably the best way to, the most effective use of Homeland Security resources is spending that is applied to detecting terrorists, and also minimizing the damages and the number of deaths if an attack was to occur and be successful. Economists also, I think, pretty much agree on the fact that spending to defend particular target is usually very inefficient. And this is borne by the understanding that there are pretty much an unlimited amount of targets and that terrorists get to decide where to go first. It's also borne by the understanding that our Homeland Security defense is always as good as the weakest link. Take, for instance, our attempt to secure our borders and prevent terrorists from bringing in dangerous things. The way we do things is like we have TSA agents to prevent things from being smuggled through airplanes. We have a strong port security, screening of cargoes, but at the same time we have thousands of miles of unprotected borders. The answer to this, of course, is not, well, let's absolutely protect and make sure that no one can get in from anywhere, because the cost of this is probably incredibly exorbitant. Another thing that actually thinking in terms of trade-offs and in terms of cost-benefit analysis that is really seriously missing in the way government in Washington in particular think about Homeland Security is it's very little thought given to who is the best actor to protect us from certain risks. So for instance, if you take the two efficient things that I actually identified as an effective and optimal way of spending a Homeland Security, which is detect terrorists. There's no doubt that this is the role of the federal government. The federal government is better equipped and to do this task. On the other hand, minimizing or responding to an attack is not. The federal government is not the best equipped to actually answer that risk. And yet, there's so much money. Homeland Security at the federal level spends so much money in things that really should be the purview of the states. In the same way, there is a gigantic tendency to try to think of protecting private properties as if it were the role of the federal government. So I think, when you, and it makes sense because, as I said, this is not the way the politics of Homeland Security works. And as a result, I think there are a lot of missed opportunity of increased security that we could get from our investment on Homeland Security. And there's a lot of waste in the way we spend our money. I've talked about how we should be thinking about Homeland Security. I would say that even if we were thinking the proper way and think about priority and cost-benefit analysis and risk management for Homeland Security, the way the money is spent right now and the organization of how the money is spent would never be conducive to more security. If you remember, there was a department, an entire department that was created supposedly to overview Homeland Security spending and Homeland Security activity. But very few people know that in that department, half of the money is spent on non-Homeland Security activities. And more importantly, half of the money spent on Homeland Security activities is actually spent outside of the Department of Homeland Security. And I don't think that reorganizing, flow charts, unfortunately, would change very much. But I think this is very telling about the way things are done in Washington, where you actually create a department, and when really, effectively, that department is overseeing mainly, not mainly, but at least half of their activities have nothing to do with Homeland Security, while half of the money spent on Homeland Security is done outside of this department.
Thank you. Ben?
So I want to start by tacking back a little bit to a point with which Veronique started, because it actually introduces fairly well thematically some of the things I wanted to talk about. She began by pointing out that the number of people killed on 9/11 was a small fraction of the number of people killed in car accidents per year or killed or who die of smoking-related illnesses. And this is a theme that you often hear, that you're more likely to drown in your bathtub than you are to die in a terrorist attack. I think that, somebody told me recently that it was now statistically safer to fly on an airplane than not to fly on an airplane. That is to stay home, because if you stay home, a tree could fall on your house. And this is, I think, a very seductive argument, and is very plausibly advanced to suggest that we are overinvesting or misinvesting in counterterrorism. It has one very substantial analytic flaw, in my view, which is that, when the cigarettes, when you stop smoking, the cigarettes don't get together and figure out how to kill you anyway. And when we successfully reduce the number of car accidents, the cars don't all figure out, well, if our brakes fail more effectively, we can get them next time. There are these countries that actually testify to the fact that terrorists do that. One of them is Pakistan. And when countries do not successfully address, and governments, to move to the theme of this panel, when governments are not constituted and don't direct themselves effectively in such a way as to address terrorism effectively, which is to say, terrorists are sentient beings, and they're smart, and they're not incapable of reacting to our failures. And countries like Pakistan, which don't do that, find that what had been an episodic little momentary problem of things blowing up becomes a profoundly destabilizing thing for a society. So, you know, my colleagues on this panel have addressed issues like surveillance, homeland security spending, and the merits of policies that we've undertaken in the course of counterterrorism. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, the name of this panel, I forget exactly what it was called, but something like the War on Terror Government. And I wanted to address a question that I think is inherent for the War on Terror government to be thinking about, and for us to be thinking about as we imagine the next block of years concerning that government. And it's so less a question of policy than a question of almost a philosophical question that any war on terrorism government in a modern era will need to think about. And it has to do with the question of whether the government is allowed to wage war against you. I don't mean you collectively or you, I mean you individually. And the broad pattern of the last few years, and it's become increasingly pronounced, as I will explain, over two developments. One is the habeas litigations in federal court from Guantanamo, and the other is the drone program. There has been a very marked trend over the last few years in particular, sort of began under the Bush administration, has really flourished during the Obama administration, though for reasons I think having nothing to do with politics, which is toward the individualization of warfare. That is, the government is no longer invading Iraq, right? It's no longer invading, you know, countries and exercising these sort of large-scale military actions. In fact, it's really quite deliberately backing off that, right? What it's doing instead is it's engaging in these very, very highly targeted military actions, sometimes by the military, sometimes under covert action authorities, but they're targeting individuals. They're waging war against people. There's a flip side to that coin, and it's a very important flip side that actually gets less discussion, which is that the government has the power increasingly to wage war against you, but you also have the power to wage war against a society in a way that is unprecedented in the history of the human race. And, you know, it used to be that if the biggest weapon you could pick up was a machine gun, and you could kill a bunch of people around you, and that was kind of all you could do. We have seen demonstrations in the last few years, which are quite striking, really, of the power to have your own personal weapons of mass destruction program. You know, around the same time as Anwar al-Awlaki was killed by one of our drones, the FBI arrested a young man in Massachusetts who was planning to fly his drone into the Pentagon packed with C4. This case, for some reason, has gotten a little bit less attention than Anwar al-Awlaki. But I think it's interesting. I mean, there is a reciprocity there that is very striking, and no pun intended. I want to talk about two levels of this individualization. One is the habeas cases. And what you see in these cases, so we tend to talk about these cases in terms of Guantanamo policy. You know, should we be detaining people outside the criminal justice system? Should we, is this guy innocent? Is he an enemy combatant? And we have a way of framing these questions in terms of detention policy. But there's actually something else going on in these cases that is in some ways at least as important and maybe more important than the formation of detention policy in these litigations, which is that the authorizing power for this detention is the same document that authorizes the war in the first place, which is to say the Congressional 2001 authorization for the use of military force. And that document, which gave the president, the power to use all necessary and appropriate force in fighting the bad guys, right, however one defines them, is that document is the source of the authority to detain in these cases. And what that means, as a functional matter, is that when the district court in Washington or the DC Circuit in Washington analyzes whether the government has the power to detain in, say, the case of Ben Wittes, they're analyzing the question of whether I fit under the AUMF. In other words, they're analyzing the question of whether the government has the power to use force to wage war against me. Now, I think the longer you reflect on that odd fact, the more you will find it odd, and the more you will find that it stands for something. I've just been shown the time, so I'm going to briefly say that this goes on in exactly the same way, albeit more visibly, when you're talking about blowing somebody up. You have an individual target in mind, and government lawyers are asking themselves the question, does this person fit under the AUMF? Do we have the power to wage war against that individual? Now, I'll just conclude by saying there's a temptation in a panel called, in a conference entitled The Constitution of Small Government, to ask ourselves the question, should government have the power to do this? Is this a power that we want the government to have to wage war against individuals? And I guess what I would say is we're past that question already. The government is going to have the power to do that. It does have the power to do that. We are living in a society that has individuals waging war against it and wages war against individuals. And the question is really, how do we want the government to do that? Do we want it to, what mechanisms of accountability do we want? What kind of rulemaking systems do we want? How do we want it overseen? But I think particularly as technology both increases your capacity to attack society and increases society's ability to attack you without touching the person sitting next to you, this question becomes a very important philosophical framework question for thinking about the constitution of small government in the context of a war on terror government.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask our panelists a couple of questions to help advance and frame our conversation. Veronique, I know you wanted to weigh in on some of the things that Ben just put on the table. Let me ask a question about the risk, the relative risk of terrorism and the best way to manage the risk of terrorism. So, if I understood you correctly, Veronique, you said one of the most efficient ways, one of the most cost-effective ways to prevent acts of terrorism is to find a terrorist and detect them. It's another word for surveillance, which I understand to be precisely the sort of program that raises some of the privacy and civil liberties concerns that Julian has put on the table. So, I guess my question is, how do you monetize those privacy costs? It's easy to know what the cost of a Department of Homeland Security is because you can count the number of dollars that are spent on it. How do you monetize the privacy and civil liberties costs that accrue from potentially invasive surveillance? And how do you offset those or balance those as against the expected benefit of a foregone attack?
Well, first, I think I will disagree a little bit with the way you frame the trade-off here, and it goes to the comment I wanted to make, which is like, while it is true that cigarettes don't, I mean, you were right about this, but it doesn't, measuring one risk of something versus the other doesn't mean that I would conclude that there is no spending, that we shouldn't be spending any money on Homeland Security. And in fact, as I said, I think detecting terrorists is a good way of doing it. But even in who we're going to detect, we should be applying this risk management process. And spying on every American, I think, is a wrong way to go about it. I mean, I'm assuming that intelligence experts have more information that all of us have, and they're capable of identifying that it is likely that there are more terrorists in Pakistan, I'm assuming, than there are within the U.S. And that's why I would actually, try to apply these type of trade-off and measurement of where it is really and who it is really we're supposed to be surveilling and trying to detect.
Can I just say, Veronique, yeah, there are more people who hate us and would like to kill us in Pakistan than there are here, but the ones who want to kill us who are here are a lot more likely to be able to do it.
But here's the thing, it's like, why aren't they killing us all of the time then? Why is it then we put all of our money on TSA when really actually if I were a terrorist in the US and if I wanted to scare that country to death and actually impose gigantic amount of cost, I would just blow, bombs in malls.
It's hard to get here, and it's hard to know who you can trust when you start conspiring when half the plots that people are engaged in include the FBI from the start. That's why it's hard for them to kill us.
But another thing to think about is is there an effective way to actually identify and protect us against all the people in the country or outside the country who want us armed? I mean, it's just this is why I think we need absolutely to be thinking about trade-offs in the things that we are trying to achieve. Sure, there are people who want to hurt us, right? Is it possible to actually put in place policy measures that actually stop all of them? I would argue probably not. And hence, it is more important to actually focus on the one who are the most likely to do it and the more willing to do it. And it's not clear, again, I'm not a security expert, but it's probably more likely to happen abroad than in the US. Does it mean we shouldn't be doing anything? No. Does it mean we should surveilling everyone? No.
Let me ask a question about the intrusiveness of surveillance, government collection of data. Going back to Julian's comments. So Julian described the use of national security letters as a very invasive form of surveillance. And we measure invasiveness of surveillance by the sensitivity and volume of the data that's collected. So I think there are two important factors there. How invasive are NSLs? How invasive is it to collect commercially available data? The phone company knows who you're calling. Your credit card company knows how you're paying for your cell phone. Your airline knows what seat you sit in. How invasive is the collection of this kind of data? And the flip side of that, another argument Julian made was collecting this data isn't effective really at all. We can't really point to any sorts of plots that have been disrupted. Is that really the case that, and this is I guess a question for Stewart and Ben, is it really the case that collection of huge troves of data really doesn't have much to say for it in terms of effectiveness?
Yeah, I think it actually has become more invasive. I mean, so as I'm sure everyone in the audience knows, as a result of the a series of Supreme Court rulings from the late 70s, where there's not that much protection for non-communications content data. So we're talking about sort of financial records, but also metadata from phone and internet communications. And this is basically used to develop what are called communities of interest. And to do link analysis, where they will start with often a target and then branch out in a kind of 6 degrees of separation model to try and build a picture of that social network. I think just the raw quantity of metadata that's now available. I mean, so we're not just talking about a list of phone numbers anymore, but lists of websites, lists of email addresses, information that, especially when aggregated and analyzed using sort of sophisticated tools that are brought to bear on it, is vastly more revealing. Again, given the techniques that are applied to it. And so does tend, for instance, to reveal patterns of association, things like membership in groups, things like patterns of reading or videos that are watched, right? So, I mean, things revealed by internet metadata include, are you going to visit websites where you look at videos of, Islamic clerics, let's say, spewing radical ideas, or any other religiously sensitive or politically unpopular ideas. And these are all things that I think do implicate core First Amendment interests, right? I mean, we remember that the Supreme Court held there was a burden on expressive association when the government tried, the government of, I think it was Alabama, tried to demand NAACP membership lists. And it's just not clear to me what the difference is between getting the membership directly and sort of inferring the membership list from the membership of, for example, a political mailing list that one target is one of the members of. So at one step, you get the rest of the membership. And so I think issues that as technology moves forward and as that kind of metadata peers more deeply into our lives, that hasn't been adequately addressed.
Can I actually push you, Julian, just a little bit on that point?
Sure.
How is the collection of metadata in the internet age different from the collection of metadata in the era of rotary telephones? So, for instance, in 1979, if the police are using a pen register and trap and trace device to find out who you're calling, if they know that you've called the local Catholic church 10 times in a week, they can probably infer something about your religious views. If they know that you've written a check to the ACLU every month on the 5th, they can probably infer something about your political orientation if they look at your campaign contributions. So now we have a lot more of that data, right? It's not just looking at an individual phone call, we're looking at dozens and dozens and dozens of phone calls. Other than the volume of data, how does the nature of the data that's collected today differ from the nature of the data that was collectible 30 years ago?
Well, first of all, I think volume is in itself a qualitative difference in a way. I mean, this is, I guess, in a way, the argument that's at issue in US v. Jones, the GPS tracking case. Well, it's true that you can be observed on a public street when you move around. Most people think that's qualitatively different from having a record of every movement you've made in any public place for 2 months. That is, qualitatively different because when you combine that information, things that are practically secret so you can imagine, for example, you go to purchase prophylactics at CVS or in public, and then later you go and have a dinner date in a public place, and then you drive on a public road, to the home of the person with whom you've been dining. It's when you combine that information that a private fact becomes evident. There's a single entity to whom the fact implicit in those public facts is observable. But also, I just think in terms of the way we actually use internet communications, again, yeah, sure, it's, if you call the Catholic Church 10 times a week, it would reveal that you were a member of that organization. That's not really how most people used the phone, I think, at the time, but true, that particular association might be revealed. But basically whole patterns of, for example, expressive activity wouldn't be in the same way, right? So something, yes, you could maybe from financial records see a particular book that someone had purchased. You'd have a limited window into their reading habits. But everything you consume on the internet basically is now contained in some way within the metadata. That is the IP address that you're visiting, and then the size and the volume of the data that's downloaded. So even if you don't have directly, for example, oh, you watched this movie on Netflix, from the size of the file, you can infer the specific thing viewed in a way that just wasn't in any way recorded 20 or 30 years ago, right? The vast majority of what you read every day, not just read, but even browsed, you pick up a magazine at a newsstand, was something that left no permanent trace. And now all of that is on our permanent record.
So, Stewart, what do we have to show for it? We have huge troves of data being collected. What is the national security upside as a result?
So let me start with the privacy implications. I mean, look, our sense of what's private and what isn't depends in substantial part on the world we live in. Brandeis thought it was shocking that somebody could take his picture and publish it in the paper without his permission. He didn't think it was shocking that strangers lived in his house, listened to his family conversation, and gossiped over the back wall with other servants. The world we live in, it defines what we think is private and what isn't. And when we live in a world where our data is shared with enormous numbers of third parties, we slowly come to accept that data is out there. And we respond in part to that by saying, well, okay, I've trusted United Airlines with all of my data about my travels. They're on probation. If I discover they're doing something bad with it, then maybe I want the government to step in and restrict it. Maybe I want to take my data elsewhere. We wait for something bad to happen. Nothing much bad happens, and so we just trust it to them. The idea that we would say, oh yeah, that can be viewed by hundreds of people to move my baggage and make my reservations, but I don't want the government to see it in order to protect me from terrorists getting on the planes, is crazy. And yet, that's sort of where we have ended up. This is a quick story, but remember I said that the two terrorists that came here that were known had made reservations in their own names. In a quick analysis that was done afterwards of the reservations of the 19 hijackers, it was discovered that you could have, just by linking things like phone numbers, addresses, and God help us, they used their frequent flyer numbers, that they shared. You could have identified everybody who was on that plane, on those planes, as part of the plot. Now, the government shortly thereafter said maybe we should have access to that information, to airline reservation data, and the response was a left-right coalition to make sure that that information could not be gathered. A crazy result, but the result that we ended up with. The final result of all of that was that we ended up with an effort to identify the terrorists who were getting on here without knowing anything about anybody who was getting on the plane. And we all know how that ended up. We treated everybody as though they were a terrorist suspect. We looked for the bombs in everybody's underwear. We're still doing that. And that is, oddly, that is a price we paid for the privacy victory that the left-right coalition got when they managed to prevent the government from knowing anything about anybody who got on the planes. They did not have access to the reservation data, even though there had been no harm shown from that.
Ben, did you want to address the potential upsides and privacy harms of widespread data collection?
Look, I mean, I'm largely in agreement with Stewart about this. I think that the place to start is the proposition that a society that has gone in big for Facebook, I don't know what their market valuation is right now, has voted with its feet on the question of privacy. And, you know, we have a rapidly evolving sense of what that word and that idea means to us. And one thing it clearly does not mean is that we mind if large numbers of people see pictures of us, see who we hang out with, see who we click that we liked, see who we're in family and social and romantic relationships with, see who we just broke up with. These are things that we apparently don't mind as a society. And I think the idea that that we're going to wall the government off from the sort of interactions with one another that we have routinely and make available to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people is just implausible as a normative matter. What's the upside? Look, I mean, when you talk to people who do investigations, the very first thing they do in the course of any counterterrorism or non-counterterrorism information is they send out a bunch of order requests, orders, demands for data. And the reason they do it is because it's useful. It's the same reason why when you meet somebody, the first thing you do is you Google and Facebook stalk them, because that's how you find out about people, and it works. And the reason you can't attribute breakthroughs in terrorist investigations to this is because it takes place at a very preliminary stage of an investigation. It's the very first thing you do. So it leads you to, oh, this is the universe of people I want to talk to. They're the people who know the person. These are the places that he was spending money. Then you go talk to them, and maybe you have a breakthrough in the case down the road, 10 witnesses, right? You don't attribute that to the original data that you received because you're so far downstream from it by that point. The fact that it is, now Julian's point is absolutely correct that, you know, you can't, you look at the volume of data. You don't see that the volume of data is correlated with you can't attribute the great counterterrorism successes to these volumes of data, but that doesn't mean it's not useful, and it doesn't mean it wouldn't be paralyzing not to have access to it.
Veronique?
I mean, I have more a question for Stewart and Ben, which is like, there's always the assumption that if the government had all this information, they would know what to do with it. If we'd had these phone numbers, if we had had this, if we had had that, then we would have been able to, government people looking at it would have been actually able to track down those terrorists and the plot. I mean, this was the rationale for, banks having to file reports for any transaction above $10,000. Turns out, there were like millions of these reports in a shared database by something like 50 different agencies, and none of them managed to see that Mohammed Atta, who was at the time on the most wanted terrorist list, had actually one of those transaction reports filed in his name. And obviously it's a little unfair to pick on agency for not having seen this one report, but I think there is this over-optimistic assumption about the fact that if only we had all this data, government employees, even like the best, would know would know that it's there. Because the reason why we can go back after an attack has happened and track down that information is because we know what to look for. And I'm afraid that gathering even more information, especially if it's like, I think some level of information is very important. But there is a moment where there's this risk of looking for a needle in a haystack, especially if you don't know what you're looking for. And I just wonder what you think.
Well, so a couple of things. First of all, Mohammed Atta was not a wanted man by any U.S. law enforcement or intelligence agency that I know of prior to 9/11. I could be wrong about that, but
he was on a most wanted terrorist list.
I don't want to argue about it. Number two, look, there is obviously a question of processing large volumes of data. This is a huge problem for any organization that manages large quantities of data. The government has more data and is less adept at it than some other organizations, and it has had a lot of help in recent years from certain private sector organizations. There are certainly cases where you have all the data you need and you fail to bring the pieces of it together in ways that allow you to make the appropriate inferences that then become blindingly obvious subsequently when you know the key piece of information. Like if you happen to know that I'm a terrorist, all sorts of information about me becomes relevant, right, in a way that may have been decidedly non-obvious beforehand. That said, and it is certainly also the case that you can, if your capacity to bring information radically outstrips your ability to process information, the marginal value of the additional piece of information is rapidly diminishes. And all of this is a very good argument for not having unrestricted access to everything all the time. It's not a good argument for not having access to that information that in fact you can process or you can learn to process that is appropriate to have given, well, first of all, the law, and secondly, sound public policy, and third, a respect for the dignity of the individuals who produced that information and turned it over to somebody. And where you draw that line, I would submit, I have my own theories about where that line should be drawn and how you draw that line, but I would submit it's not a question that the Fourth Amendment really answers for most categories of data. It's not a question, it's a question that our theoretical literature has a alarmingly high, like big piles of data with a needle somewhere in there, noise to signal ratio. It's a huge literature that is very unavailing in my opinion. And I think there is a question that we should have a serious conversation about. How do we feel about the fact that all of our lives have been mapped and, as Julian says, sort of permanently or semi-permanently recorded in very different levels of detail depending on the kinds of information. And that's a foundational question of life in our future society that we have not fully answered yet. And I would submit that the attempt to answer it by reference to past concepts like privacy and the Fourth Amendment and search and seizure are not going to get us where we need to be.
Let me push both Ben and Stewart on a point that both of them made earlier, which is that members of society are voluntarily disclosing huge troves of information about themselves to the public. The idea is that because we tell our Facebook friends and anybody else who cares to Google us information about our relationship status, we don't really have to worry as much about government gaining access to this information. Is that fair? Aren't there reasons to worry about government gaining access to the same data that we disclose to private persons? If Amazon knows my book buying preferences, the worst they can do is send me a couple of annoying emails a day. The government has coercive powers that it can use against me, and maybe we should worry more about disclosure of this data to the state than we do about disclosure of this data to United Airlines?
Well, yes and no. For sure, it's different when the government has it than when they don't. And the bad news is if you think the government is going to treat you badly, then that's a risk that you don't have with Amazon. The good news is, of course, the government may also be using that same information to protect you from people that wish you harm. So, in general, I would rather have the government know more about the people on the planes that I'm flying on, even if it includes myself, than know less. And I think that's, while it is true, they could treat me badly, especially this administration, as a refugee from the last. But I don't think that's a particularly high likelihood compared to the likelihood that somebody from Al Qaeda wants to treat me badly. And so I would suggest that while it's a different form of analysis, the way to approach that is to say, how can we prevent misuse of that information? There are plenty of ways to do that. They use technology that audit the access and what's done with the data afterwards. And I think a rigorous analysis of the tools that are available to prevent misuse satisfy most people who don't live in a world where the U.S. government is teetering on the brink of fascism.
So
or socialism, sorry.
Well, let me just historically, right? I mean, the issue here is that mass gathering of data enables discretion, not for mass privacy violation, but for targeted privacy violations. So if you look back to the kinds of abuses that were uncovered by the Church Committee, you see things like J. Edgar Hoover's June Mail program, right? There were, anytime an agent came across a salacious tidbit about...
Okay, can I just stop for a second? Were you even in high school when that happened? We've had this massive expansion of the security state, all this data gathered. Can't you pick an example from the last 10 damn years?
I could. But I wonder, look, part of the problem here, right, is that it takes decades to find out about abuses of these powers because they're exercised in secret and because the abuses usually don't take the form of, hauling someone into court. So again, you talk about the Hoover program, right? What it was collecting in a personal and confidential file all these salacious tidbits. And then you had that information, so when, for instance, there's a real case, a few years later, the person you got a record about a traffic stop where he was late at night in a car with a woman not his wife, is on the Appropriations Committee. You mention this to him and you don't have problems with appropriations anymore. There were a lot of people, a huge number of activists that were spied on.
Julian, now he would just tweet it himself. It wouldn't be a problem.
Well, I also want to make the point that, right, polls suggest that something like half of internet users have, searched, for example, for online pornography. I think they're they're called men. So it's true, that's information they've disclosed to some server somewhere in the bowels of Google. That's not the same thing, I think, as saying, well, that information is now public. Because, it's been disclosed to Google, so now if the government wants to compile a list of, people with weird fetish tastes or something. And again, this is actually, again, precisely the kind of thing that was in the past used to a destructive effect. There was an attempt in the 60s to use tapes of Martin Luther King's extramarital liaisons to basically drive him into suicide. It succeeded in driving him into a profound depression. He did not, fortunately, kill himself. But the idea was that he would be removed from the board and replaced with what the FBI called the right kind of Negro leader, who would be covertly sponsored by the Bureau. And this is on the historical record. There are internal documents describing this idea, and it didn't fortunately come to pass. But that is the kind of harm, not of mass privacy violation, but of the ability to target any individual with potentially enormous consequences. And again, the worry is, this is something you find out about a decade later.
So let me go straight at that, because the idea is, well, the harms to civil liberties are hidden away and we don't see them for a while, and so we should give them greater weight than their apparent absence would suggest. But in fact, after Hoover died, the Attorney General said, we will never have that again. The FBI must have a predicate for gathering facts and printing out and creating a file on an individual, must be an investigation of some sort. And so those rules were in effect right up until September 11, 2001, when it turned out, when they looked back, that the FBI agents were the only people in the world who were not allowed to print out the results of their Google searches of people's names. That was a cost, a hidden cost to the efficiency of government that didn't come out for years and years, for 25 years, or pick the invention of the search engine, 1995. The search engine was around for a long time. FBI could not use it efficiently because of these rules. The privacy rules that are adopted in haste in response to a particular technological era almost always end up having and creating privacy victims farther down the road.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience, please. So happy to entertain your questions. The only thing we ask is that your question be a question. Please begin by giving us your name and where you're from. Yes, sir, please.
Jerry Walpin from New York. I must say that this panel, while extremely interesting, was the most troubling panel that I've attended for 2 days.
Thank you.
Maybe that's good. I start out with Stewart Baker's comment and that he is obnoxious. That troubled me most because of the simple reason that...
Wasn't that truth in advertising?
Well, not really. Being adamant in support of the protection of this country and its people is not obnoxious. With regard to, and my question will be for, is it pronounced Veronique? We do know, I presume and understand, that there are people in this world who want to destroy Americans and kill them even with nuclear weapons or other type of extreme weapons. And we know that they exist or will exist shortly. They exist in Pakistan, which are not very safeguarded. There are weapons that exist in Libya that may not be nuclear, but have other possibilities of multiple killings, much more than just the 3,000, and even the 150,000, I think was the number you used for cancer deaths, which everybody would love to try and prevent. We know that presidential war powers exist from the Constitution, and indeed we applaud and respect one of the greatest uses of presidential power to deprive people of their constitutional rights. That's called the Emancipation Proclamation, which President Lincoln signed as part of his war powers in order to deprive Southerners of their property of slaves. We all applaud that. My question of you is, knowing all of this, and knowing that there sure has to be a balancing of civil liberties of individuals with the threat against the life and security of Americans in this country, and and that even our forefathers said and made clear that the protection of the life and safety of Americans is the first primary purpose of government. Given that, do you agree that there has to be a balancing of the two, and that when the danger to the security of and life of Americans is greater, that then the balance, the pendulum swings towards the protection of Americans? And if you do agree, what sort of extension of what you wouldn't have in simple, happy peacetime, what sort of extension of powers would you allow to the government to protect the American people?
Thank you.
I guess I would say that I don't know that we know everything you say we know. And the other thing is, like, if we actually do know all of these things and this, then why don't we focus on this, on trying to actually really prevent people from blowing us up, rather than do most of the stuff that we do for Homeland Security, which is at best going to be completely useless, and at worst is actually diverting resources from places where it would be effective. So for instance, you talk about nuclear threat. I mean, there's one way the other thing is, like, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that they are threats that we can't address in a cost-effective manner, or even that they are threats that we can't prevent even if we were to spend our entire budget to actually try to prevent it. And I think this is like something that people just refuse because it goes against everything. We want to do something, but there are things where actually we can't.
So we can't do anything.
No, I'm not saying we can't do anything. I'm just saying that I think we divert a lot of resources against the away from the real threat in order to actually spend a little bit of money across the board for a whole lot of threats that are just not that important. The federal government does a lot of things that it shouldn't be doing. Grants to the states for emergency, for first responders, which are widely known to be spent on things that are completely useless. That should be the purview of the states. If you want to prevent, if you are scared of a nuclear threat, I mean, the best thing to do is to protect fissile material, right? Rather than actually try to pretend that we're making sure that cargoes coming into the U.S. Are not going to have a bomb in them, especially considering that this is only, even if we were effective at doing this, there are so many other ways where terrorists could actually bring a bomb. So I would argue that there are things that we can do, but we absolutely must have a conversation about what it is we actually know and what are actually the risks, not only the most important in terms of what were the one that would endanger America the most, but how we can go about addressing these threats in an effective manner. It's not about not doing anything, but it's certainly not about doing everything poorly.
Here's an example, right? Rizwan Firdaus is an unemployed punk band drummer living with his parents in Massachusetts. He had entertained this fantasy scenario where he was going to load up a couple of model airplanes with C4, fly them into the Pentagon, blow a hole in the wall, and then storm in there like the Matrix with guns blazing and take out, everyone inside the Pentagon, I guess. It took a multi-month sting during which the agent sort of had to prod this guy to, actually start making progress on his crazy plan. They had to pay for his ticket to D.C. to scope out the scene. He needed them to procure weapons and C4 for him. And so, is this someone who wanted to harm America? Is this a bad person? Yeah, absolutely. Is the threat he actually presents, something that requires us to mobilize FBI teams and many thousands of dollars over many months? Is this the threat that's proportionate to the resources we're expending on it? Well, I don't know. I find him a less than credible threat, and I find a lot of the guys we've picked up in the last few years less than credible threats.
I would say I agree with Veronique. We need to look closely at whether particular expenditures make sense and who should be making them. That absolutely is the right answer. And sometimes you have to get a little gimlet-eyed about whether you're spending money in the right place. I'm struck by the fact that when she talks about privacy, she sort of gets a little misty-eyed. We can value privacy. You have a choice every time you buy gas, whether you're going to walk in and pay cash or slide your credit card into the machine, and there's a price that you're paying in privacy for sliding your credit card into the machine, and there's an advantage in that you get 1/10 of 1 cent in rewards. That's the value you put on your privacy right there. I haven't yet heard her say, sure, we can value that.
Next question, please.
Dovetailing on that point, Trevor Bursch from the Cato Institute. Are we confusing the issue by talking about threats to America? And have we not talked enough about how bad these threats actually are, how horribly difficult it is to make a nuclear weapon, like experiments with suitcase nuclear weapons in the 60s, and how our ability to do that, how idiotic it is to make a dirty bomb, and how little the threat is, even if it was happened to be put off, just in lives. I mean, we're talking about, we say a threat to America, and the previous question was, you know, these are a threat to America. They're a threat to citizens. And you said there's a qualitative difference here, but people warring on America, so can America war on them? It's not changed since anarchists bombed Wall Street in the teens. It hasn't. I mean, they may be able to kill more people, but is it just how many people have to be able to kill to change the nature of the debate? These threats need to be analyzed on that level, it would seem, and not just with rhetoric about destroying America and attacking America and what they can do.
I actually had a little bit of trouble hearing you. Your voice was very muffled, and I had a little bit of trouble. I think I understood your question, but if I go off on a tangent that's unrelated to it, stop me and redirect me.
I can give a summation really quickly if you want me to.
Just step a little bit away from the mic when you do.
Can you hear me now?
No, not at all.
See, that's the point where it's right there.
Okay. No, I think I heard you. Look, I mean, there are buffoons who are want to hurt America and want to hurt individuals in America and want to hurt people, and we take them seriously because they have a 1 or 2% chance of succeeding, and they have a more sizable chance of hurting somebody in the effort. And there are people who seem like such buffoons who are really, really scary guys. So if I told you prospectively that there was a guy who was a burnout from the Berkeley math department who was living in a shack in Montana and trying to build bombs out of wood, that would not sound all that different from what Julian was just describing. He was going to use snail mail to get them to people, and you know. And similarly, if I told you there were these 19 guys who were living in hanging out in Hamburg, and had dreams of bringing down airplanes into buildings, and they were being led by a guy who'd actually tried this. And who had wanted to bring down 10 planes running out of the Philippines, and had kind of blown it. That would be the kind of thing that you'd say, well, run it up the flagpole, but it's not. So I mean, which these people are is much easier to discern in retrospect than it is in prospectively. And with respect, to, and sometimes actually, when the FBI this is a paradox of the investigations of this stuff, the more effective the Bureau is, the earlier in the plot it intervenes. And it makes sure that you don't make contact with real Al-Qaeda, you make contact with, the right sort of Al-Qaeda, as in an FBI agent, right? Sort of like, the SCLC, only it's legitimate. But you replace the fake the real Al-Qaeda leaders with your FBI agents, and you intervene very, very early in the plot. And the result is, looking at it in retrospect, it's really hard to tell Is this somebody who, in retrospect, we think is Muhammad Atta? Is it somebody who we, in retrospect, think is, is Ted Kaczynski? Or is it somebody who we think is one of these buffoons who may have hurt himself and, who meant harm but wasn't effective, couldn't possibly have actually pulled it off? And I think the more ambitious the plot gets, whether, into biological stuff, into nuclear stuff, the more you have that problem, because it's pretty easy to take a machine gun and blow away a mall or a campus, right? That's pretty easy. It's pretty hard to pull off a major, WMD strike. And so the more ambitious the plot is, the more you do have that problem.
Yes, sir, thank you.
This is actually a question for the entire panel. Because it seems like while there's disagreement on exactly what kind of cost and benefits we give most significant attention to, there doesn't seem to be any foundational disagreement that any kind of security policy has to involve a weighing of cost and benefits at the outset to determine whether it's worth pursuing. And so my question is, in a situation where much of the information that would otherwise be relevant to that kind of inquiry is classified, because that kind of classification is necessary for security purposes. How does that affect our ability to determine whether or not certain security policies are in fact effective? And in that kind of environment, what should individual citizens, for example, do if they're trying to figure out whether they think that a certain power given to a government agency, for example, should be exercised, should be expanded, should be contracted? What does that process look like?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll try to discuss it. First, on the cost side, I think it's fundamentally wrong-headed to say, oh, well, traffic deaths are just like having to leap from a window on the 101st floor of the trade center. That is perceived differently by everyone. It is an assault on the order of our society, and quite a deliberate one, to say you cannot protect your people, your entire society is based on a lie, and we can show it to you over and over again. You have to respond to that in a way that is different from more accidents on the highway. And in terms of measuring the effectiveness of alternative measures, I grant you, I think you can overstate how much data is actually classified. Under the pressure of debate, this kind of data does get declassified and does get made available, but it's also the case that even within classified environments, there is not an unlimited supply of money, notwithstanding what you might think. And people have to make decisions about where are we going to spend our money, what is most effective, and they want to spend it on the things that are most effective. And by far, the cheapest way to approach most problems of identifying terrorists and people that you want to stop is to have enough information to say we can let 99 people walk through and the 100th is going to get a very careful scrutiny, which is what we do at the border. And we use a lot of data to make those decisions, and it has turned out to be a surprisingly effective approach to border security.
Yes, please.
Paul Wolfgram, William and Mary Law. Mr. Baker mentioned that it is difficult to enter this country, but the problem of national debt has made the problem of illegal immigration increasingly visible. To what extent should we prioritize spending on invasive domestic intelligence collection over border security and the vetting of new immigrants? And if homegrown terrorism is such a large threat, to what extent do increasing permissions for domestic intelligence collection create civil unrest from citizens' perception of rights violations and increase the threat of homegrown terrorism?
So I'm not at all persuaded that debating this issue and taking the view that we ought to have these measures or that we don't have these measures should be assigned as a reason for terrorism and civil unrest. I think that is the kind of argument that we heard after the Oklahoma City bombing that was used to shut down a whole bunch of dissent on the right, and we shouldn't tolerate it as a tactic in the debate. Terrorism and terrorists are responsible for their terrorism, not the people who argue about these issues. Illegal immigration for sure is a problem, and there is a risk that terrorists could come across the border in the Southwest in particular, but also conceivably from Canada, not at a port of entry. It is harder than you think to sneak across the border. That doesn't mean that we have solved the illegal immigration problem, but I would guess that most people who come into the United States illegally from Mexico are stopped once or twice before they get in. Now, that doesn't stop them from getting in eventually, but if they were terrorists, everybody who gets stopped gets fingerprinted, gets interrogated in Spanish by Spanish-speaking Border Patrol agents, and if they're actually from Afghanistan, it ain't going to work out so well for them. So we have more protection at the border, notwithstanding our illegal immigration problem, than you might think.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like each of the panelists to put a specific number on something that actually has to have a specific number. Let us stipulate that to assassinate 9 Americans who haven't committed a crime but who will perpetuate a successful terrorist act, we have to assassinate 1 American who is in fact innocent. What is the number of people that, random terrorist deaths you have to save to justify killing that 1 innocent person when it's 1 out of 10, and what is it if it's 1 out of 100?
I'm just to clarify a question. Do you mean what is an acceptable rate of collateral damage, or do you mean if we are targeting?
We're targeting specific individuals, and we're right 90% of the time, or we're right 99% of the time. How many lives do we have to save by doing that? In order to justify the specific and known and targeted sort of act of killing the innocent person.
Well, let me start by objecting vociferously to the nature of the question, which is not a question that we ask in the criminal justice system. We don't say proof beyond a reasonable doubt means you have to be 96.8% certain, and if you exceed that, if you move up into the 97% range, you're no good. And similarly, in the law of war context, we don't say proportionality means you have an obligation in targeting to target with discrimination and proportionality, and we don't say that means that if 3 extra guys slip in who are actually kids and they're just there along for the ride, and that's an unacceptable rate. These aren't numerical calculations. Now, and they invariably involve a certain measure of judgment as to whether the process was reasonable, not look at, and of course, judgment as to whether the process is reasonable.
Well, you have to agree to my stipulations. I know they're hypothetical and not realized in the world.
I'm not going to agree with the stipulations, because I think they lead you down a path that produces wrong answers because you're asking the wrong question. And I think the right question, and actually sitting in the front row here is a gentleman who has just written a paper about the right question. And so I'm going to give a little shout out to Greg McNeil, who's just written a long paper about about targeting standards. And the right answer, it seems to me, is, do you believe in your processes? Have you set up the sort of processes that will, in general, do the best you can to get the right guys and not get the wrong guys? And if you do that with the expectation that there are going to be errors, you're going to make mistakes, and you try to design the best process you can. And as you see that you're uncomfortable with your rate of errors, you adjust your processes. But if you reduce it to a number, I mean, maybe an economist would tell you that's a good idea. I can't go there.
Yes, sir.
My name is Stephen Wallach. I'm a litigator from New York. Please let me know if my voice is being muffled or otherwise distorted. My question for Mr. Sánchez initially, am I wrong in my thinking that, especially as a New Yorker, my life and my family's lives would be better off following Mr. Baker's and Mr. Wittes' view of the world, because given civil rights, civil liberties, and cost-benefit analysis they're due, it's better in the gray areas, whether they are light gray or medium gray or dark gray, to err on the side of the viewpoints that Mr. Baker and Wittes are expressing.
So I mentioned I'm also a former New Yorker myself, so I was actually a New Yorker on 9/11. Well, again, what I think we want to do is demand, something beyond vague assurances that tools are, useful in some nebulous sense before we decide that that they're worth the cost, not just in terms of privacy and liberties, but the economic cost, the opportunity cost of devoting resources to other approaches. I mean, so if you look at what's actually effective in foiling terror plots, it seems to be overwhelmingly, basically human intelligence tips from people in the community, informers. In the case of Najib al-Azazi, it was a tip from Pakistani intelligence. We see that the kind of methods that look like they actually result in plots like this being disrupted are not the ones that involve drowning in enormous amounts of sucking data from the fire hose and spending many billions of dollars trying to make sense of it. We've seen an enormous number of dollars wasted on systems like NSA's Trailblazer that end up not working, end up running billions over budget, and you're not any safer, for example, because we spent $1 billion on Trailblazer because it didn't work. So yeah, I think the demand should be never give up any privacy, but ask that it work, not just because it's dangerous for a government to have enormous caches of data about everyone, but because money and time you spend on these methods when they're not as effective as other things you could be doing, don't do anything to make you safer in exchange, or at least don't do enough to make you safer to justify doing that and not doing other things that work better.
Julian left off that list of things that are effective, one thing for ideological reasons. It's data. And if I remember right, the Zazi case was indeed one where there was a hint from Pakistani intelligence, but that hint was turned into an elaborate review of all of the travel data. They had a name or a partial name and a range of dates in which the travel occurred. They knew this bad guy was coming, and that's all they knew. They went through all of the travel reservation data to determine who this suspect was in a much more fine-tuned way than they could have without the data, and that's how they located Zazi. The data was a crucial part in addition to the intelligence that they got from Pakistan.
No one I think disagrees with the idea that there should be an ability to get data, that data is useful for investigations, but again, it's a question of how much data, when, and according to what standard. A lot of the authorities that have been used successfully in post-9/11 investigations seem, at least again on the basis of what's public, as though even on the pre-Patriot standard, the same the same wiretap could have been obtained, the same records could have been obtained, given what the government knew at the time they began using those tools.
I'm sorry.
The question is about the marginal benefit, right? And of creating a particular standard before allowing access to data. Are you less safe if the standard is, X amount higher? And I don't think there's an enormous amount of evidence that there's, again, a marginal plot foiled, that wouldn't have been under a previous standard.
So we have time for two more questions before we have to break. So let me ask this gentleman and Roger to state their questions one after the other, and we'll have the members of the panel respond.
My name is Robert Schwartz. I am also apparently from New York. What a surprise given the circumstances. But I would like to ask a question of Veronique and of Julian. You both stated that the threat of terrorism now is less substantial. Number one, I'd like to know where you're getting that information from, and if that's true. Number two, do you think that might have something to do with all of the protections which have been put in place that have been changes to the federal government in terms of anti-terrorism laws?
And I'm Roger Pilon. I used to be from New York. Now I'm from the Cato Institute here in Washington. I want to return to the question that Nathan posed at the beginning of the discussion period, which I did not hear an answer to. It was posed to Veronique and to Julian. The question was, Veronique seemed to be saying that cost benefit is important, and what we should be doing is directing our attention to finding out who is a terrorist, which of course is a nice echo of Judge Richard Posner on that very point, who said that finding that is like looking for a needle in a haystack. In order to do that, though, you've got to do the kind of data mining that Julian, with his extraordinary concern for privacy, has argued both here and elsewhere, though he's gone back and forth on it, is an invasion of privacy. It's precisely that kind of data mining, Stewart just pointed to, that is essential if you're going to treat the Fourth Amendment as at all relevant in the war on terror, that is necessary to give you the information for a probable cause requirement for going into court and getting a warrant once you've determined who is or might be a terrorist. So it seems to me that we've got to do just the kind of data mining that is essential for determining these preliminary considerations, because at the end of the day, the problem is, as Richard Posner said, trying to find out who is a terrorist in this great world of millions and millions of people where we just don't have that information, and you can't wait for an ex post situation. You've got to go to an ex ante situation in terrorism.
Thank you, Roger. Let me ask each of the panelists to give their thoughts on those two questions, please.
I don't think I said that the risk of terrorism now is lower than it used to be. I don't know. I'm hoping law enforcement can answer that question. I'm more concerned about the fact that there's actually very little investigation in whether it is actually the case that we're more at risk, and if the answer, I'm not sure. I think we're on a path where, we're going to keep on spending on Homeland Security more and more and more, possibly in ways that are completely disconnected from the risk we face. And Stewart at some point made a crack, which was very funny, about the previous administration and this administration. I actually think that it's pretty fascinating to see that there's little change from one administration to the other, because that's the way government does. You create a department, you start spending, and there's an expectation that you're going to keep spending more and more and more and more. And that's totally independent. I don't see government agency actually doing really the job they should be doing, and even asking whether they should be spending that money, whether that money is best spent, whether that money on a given program is actually more useful and getting more return than the money spent on another program. I don't see this anyone overlooking the overall thing. As for going back to gathering information and intelligence, there is no doubt that this is actually probably good use of information. I would argue, however, that if you think, that you have to collect information on absolutely everyone to be able to find out who's a terrorist, you're going to fail. And I think that's it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. On the other hand, I'm hoping that law enforcement and intelligence agencies have a way to narrow down the kind of information that they're trying to get on people based on the risks they represent, based on some of their characteristics. But it's not clear that a lot of the way information is gathered is actually based on these type of process. That's pretty much all I'm saying.
Any other concluding thoughts from the panel?
So a couple things. So the reason to think that there are the risk of the serious risk has declined is, sort of one, anecdotally looking at the gravity of actual, people who are prosecuted, but also just, again, looking at the frequency with which federal prosecutors just decline referrals from the FBI. If the hits they were getting were mostly real serious threats and cases, I don't think you'd see, rates 80 to 90% declination. I think the really important thing we've done to contribute to that is, of course, disrupting Al-Qaeda overseas, their ability to train and send people here. But I think it's actually just never been the case that there are a huge number of people who are not just angry but really willing to die to kill large numbers of Americans. As for Roger, so data mining is a really big word that encompasses a lot of different kinds of activities, some of which, when we're narrowly targeted, there are things that you would call data mining that are effective. But as to the sort of broader question of whether this kind of large-scale predictive data mining is essential, I would say there's just not any evidence that that's true, because it's not essential if it doesn't work very well. And terrorism is a low enough frequency event relative to the pool of the entire population, that what you end up doing, and what FBI agents complained about in the aftermath of the NSA data mining and warrantless wiretap program, is that they were getting sent on wild goose chases that wasted their time, because you ended up with a lot more false positives than genuine hits. So it actually doesn't seem like it's that essential. It seems like it's mostly a distraction.
So I guess I would say that we often remarked on the irony after 9/11 as we were working at DHS, that the better we were at our job, the more people thought they didn't have to worry about the things that we were worrying about. And in the long run, that leads people to think maybe they're spending too much on the job you're doing, because after all, we've gone 10 years without a serious attack. And I think that is the proof.
Through, Stewart.
11, yeah. So that's the proof is in the pudding. We've obviously done a fair amount of things right. This is sort of like playing pickup stick. You know the game pickup sticks, right? Where you just keep pulling out a stick. I think that's the recipe that Julian and Veronique are offering, except we're playing it with dynamite, right? We just keep pulling out sticks. Say, well, we don't, maybe we don't need them all. I can pull this one out. Hey, look, it's still standing. There's a point at which you say, I'm just not willing to play anymore. DHS's budget has probably been more or less flat for a couple of years. The idea that the budgets are going up and up and up is wrong at DHS. That money's going to electric bullet trains, I think. Now, I think we'd be better off spending it on DHS, but those choices have been made. I don't think we should be continuing to expand all aspects of Homeland Security, for sure, but it's very dangerous to say, well, nothing bad's happened, so I guess we can do less, because the only proof that that's a bad idea is when something bad happens.
But I guess the thing that I think everybody up here agrees on is the general proposition that you need to collect what is actually useful. B, that you shouldn't collect things that are not actually useful. And C, that there is some set of trade-offs associated with, unknown benefits in exchange for unknown quantities of material that has unknown privacy impact. And so I don't think there's a basic disagreement here about the working premises, which is that you don't want government wholesale inhaling all the data in the world and doing whatever it wants with it with no accountability. And similarly, I don't think there's anybody up here who's saying, if it's necessary and you can show it's needed, then don't do it anyway. Although there are people who believe that, by the way. I don't think anybody up here has made that argument. And so the crux of the disagreement really comes down to a set of instincts about what the value is of certain information that you could collect or not, and you will generally not be able to show a direct line between the collection of that information and the foiling of specific plots. And it's a question of whether you see that as the marginal benefit of that information as likely exceeding or likely not exceeding the also very difficult to determine likely privacy harms associated with that. I am Personally, among the list of things that threaten my privacy, the government is very low on my list of concerns in that regard. And you know, I have a list of concerns. I do worry about my privacy in certain areas. You know, when I send an email, when I post on Facebook, when I do all kinds of things, there are a lot of people that I'm worried about seeing that, who I think are probably intercepting it, including many, many foreign intelligence services. One thing I'm not worried about is the FBI intercepting it, because they're actually operating under a set of reasonable rules. And so I think that there's, you know, part of it goes to a very basic, instinctive question of how much or how little do you trust the regularity of process and the systems of oversight of that process. You know, whatever you say ex ante in answer to that question, you can look very foolish in retrospect. My level of trust is relatively high in this space, and that does condition my sense of what the relative threats to me are. And I think, you know, the more abuses I see, and I see very few, but Julian's point that you don't see them until 10 years later, the more I see 10 years from now or 1 year from now about 10 years ago, the less that may be true. But for now, I think in the balancing of harms, the relative harms, and my perceptions of what threatens my liberty and my security, which I tend to think of as the same things, the U.S. government is relatively low on my list of anxieties in that regard.
So before we break, there's one last logistical point. This room is the location of the Barbara K. Olson Memorial Lecture, which means all of us are going to have to vacate it right now and move beyond the place where they are checking people's tickets. So as we do that, let me invite you to join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion.